A fuel shortage has begun in the gas station state of Russia and its occupied territories. In May and early June, a fairly clear chain of events emerged. Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries, oil depots, pipeline and frontline logistics of the Russian Federation, to a reduction in available refining capacity and complications in fuel delivery, to queues, ration coupons, sales limits, rising prices, and fuel export bans. This manifested most noticeably in occupied Crimea, but Russian sources are already recording restrictions or strain in at least a number of regions within the Russian Federation itself. In May 2026, a series of strikes was recorded on key Russian oil refineries: Syzron, Tuapse, Norsy near Kstovo, Moscow Oil Refinery, Ryazan Oil Refinery, Perm Oil Refinery, Yaroslav, Astrakhan Gas Processing Plant, and other facilities. According to Reuters estimates, from January to May alone, approximately 700,000 barrels per day of Russian refining capacity were knocked out, and in April, exports of Russian petroleum products fell to the lowest level in available IEA statistics. Separately, it is important to note that the strikes targeted more than just oil refineries. In late May and early June, Ukrainian drones struck an oil pumping station, a refinery, and a fuel depot in various regions of the Russian Federation. In particular, hits were reported at the Saratov oil refinery, the Lazarevo station along the pipeline route, and a fuel depot in the Rostov region near occupied Donetsk. Reuters directly links this to gasoline sales restrictions in Crimea. In parallel, Ukraine intensified so-called medium-range strikes on enemy logistics at a depth of 30 to 180 kilometers from the front line. Reuters describes this campaign as a strike at radars, air defense, communications, logistics, command posts, fuel depots, and transport vehicles. Its consequence is that it has become more difficult for Russian troops to quickly redeploy reserves, ammunition, and fuel. A separate node of this campaign is the R-280 highway, i.e. the land corridor connecting Rostov-on-Don, the occupied south of Ukraine, and Crimea. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine describes this highway as a key military logistic route spanning over 500 kilometers, which the Russian Federation uses to supply fuel, ammunition, and hardware to its southern grouping. In May, Ukrainian drones systematically struck trucks, fuel tankers, equipment, warehouses, and logistic infrastructure along this direction. This is exactly why Crimea became an indicator of the problem. Reuters reported that the Russian Occupation Administration of Crimea tightened fuel restrictions, cash sales of gasoline, and the issuance of new ration coupons were suspended, while transactions using existing coupons were capped at 20 liters. This stems from queues and supply complications following Ukrainian strikes on fuel logistics. The independent Russian media outlet Novaya Gazeta Europe also linked the shortage in Crimea to the strikes on the R-280 highway. According to their data, multi-kilometer queues appeared in occupied Crimea. AI-95 gasoline began to be distributed primarily to municipal and social services, as well as via coupons. AI-92 was restricted to 20 liters per vehicle, and sales into jerrycans were banned. Retail and wholesale prices for gasoline and diesel were rising in the Russian Federation, especially in the central regions. Russian traders reported difficulties in purchasing AI-95, even at a premium, with shipment delays reaching 2 to 4 weeks. A gasoline export ban was implemented, additional restrictions were discussed, and purchases of Belarusian gasoline increased. As early as May 12th, the Russian newspaper Kommersant wrote that the situation with AI-95 on the market was deteriorating because of unscheduled refinery maintenance, lower primary refining volumes, and seasonal surge in demand. The publication's sources stated that gasoline was becoming difficult to buy even with a markup, and shipment times were increasing to 2 to 4 weeks. By early June, Kommersant was already writing about accelerated price growth in the Moscow region, logistical difficulties, a reduction in wholesale sales, and the risk of the shortage spreading to new regions if the situation failed to stabilize. The official Russian line is that there is no shortage, the market is stable. Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Alexander Novak, stated that there is no fuel at gas stations and that the situation on the domestic market is under control. Yet, even within this same information field, logistical problems in Crimea, coupons, sales restrictions, and the need for time to normalize the situation are acknowledged.
The Kremlin cannot directly admit that Ukrainian strikes are producing a strategic effect. Therefore, official rhetoric reduces the problem to logistics, seasonal demand, or scheduled maintenance. However, Russian market sources, regional restrictions, queues, and export bans show otherwise. The system is already operating in a loss compensation mode. Novaya Gazeta Europe presents a harsher picture. According to their calculations, restrictions on fuel purchases have appeared in at least 15 regions of the Russian Federation, as well as in Crimea and the occupied Luhansk region. The publication also estimates that a significant portion of Russian refining capacity is operating with limitations or has been shut down. Western sources view the strikes not as isolated episodes, but as a systemic campaign against Russia's ability to finance and sustain the war. Reuters explicitly points out that Ukrainian strikes on oil infrastructure put pressure on Russia's oil revenues, which constitute a vital part of the federal budget, and also reduce the availability of petroleum products. The Guardian, citing analyst estimates and statements of European officials, frames Ukrainian deep strikes as a factor creating political, economic, and psychological pressure on the Kremlin. European diplomacy is also increasingly clearly linking strikes on the oil sector to the weakening of the resource base for Russia's war. Thus, a specific framework is taking shape among partner countries. Ukraine is not merely responding with strikes, but is conducting a technological campaign of attrition on Russian revenues, refining, logistics, and rear supply lines of the army. Ukraine is scaling up not only the number of strikes, but its industrial base. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the number of specialized defense companies grew from fewer than 10 in 2022 to approximately 1,500 in 2026, with about a third operating in the field of unmanned systems. Drone production grew from a few thousand in 2022 to 4 million in 2025, and the target for 2026 is over 7 million. Ukrainian officials also state that provided funding is available, Ukrainian industry is capable of producing up to 20 million drones per year and thousands of missiles, particularly for deep strikes and air defense. It is separately noted that medium-range drones already enable around 5,000 strikes per month on targets at a distance of over 20 kilometers, primarily to block Russian logistics. Partners are also increasing funding for the Ukrainian defense industry. In 2026, the European Commission is pushing forward a large support package for Ukraine, part of which is intended specifically for defense industrial capabilities, including urgent procurement of drones, missiles, and ammunition. Individual countries have already announced contributions to Ukrainian drone production and joint defense projects. The Netherlands, Germany, Norway, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and other partners support drone deals, PDALE, air defense deliveries, ammunition, and the development of production inside Ukraine. Reuters also reported on the development of Ukrainian missile industry. The company Firepoint is testing new missile solutions, producing thousands of long-range drones per month, and developing the Flamingo cruise missile, which is already mentioned as a tool for strikes against vital Russian military-industrial facilities. A likely forecast for the coming months could be as follows. The intensity of Ukrainian strikes on the Russian Federation may increase, provided stable funding for the production of drones, missiles, components, and guidance systems is secured. Ukraine has already demonstrated that it is capable of combining deep strikes on oil refineries and terminals with medium-range pressure on the logistics of the occupied territories. Most likely consequences for the Russian Federation in the coming months. Local fuel crises, primarily in Crimea, occupied areas of the south and border/southern regions of the Russian Federation. Price growth and shortages of specific gasoline grades, especially AI-95, which has already been mentioned by Russian market sources as problematic. More administrative restrictions, sales limits, ration coupons, bans on sales into jerry cans, and priority for military and public services. Reduced exports of petroleum products or new export bans, as the Russian Federation will have to divert fuel to the domestic market. Higher logistical costs for the Russian army, especially in the southern direction, where fuel must be delivered via increasingly dangerous routes. Problems with oil extraction due to the lack of sufficient refining capacity to process the extracted crude oil. Ukraine is not just hitting Russian oil. Ukraine is hitting Russia's capability to turn oil into fuel, deliver it to the army, and hide the consequences from its own population. Crimean queues, coupons, limits, and Russian export bans are no longer informational noise, but practical symptoms of a successful Ukrainian campaign of attrition.
In summary, the following can be stated. Russia has oil, but is vulnerable in refining and logistics. Crimea became the first major indicator of the fuel crisis because it relies on limited supply routes. Ukrainian strikes on refineries and the R280 highway create a cascading problem rather than a one-off effect. The Kremlin denies the shortage, but introduces limits, coupons, and export restrictions itself. The scaling up of Ukrainian drone and missile production means that pressure on the Russian Federation may intensify as early as the summer of 2026. Thank you for watching. Stay on the side of good. Subscribe to the channel. Glory to Ukraine.